Guide to the Knowledge of God, a Study of the Chief Theodicies, by Alphonse Gratry. Part First, Chapter 1, Explanatory. Wisdom, says Bossuet, consists in knowing God and knowing oneself. These words are, in brief, a true definition of philosophy. They mean at the outset that philosophy is the search for wisdom. That is, the search, both theoretical and practical, for goodness and truth. They declare that philosophy is not that abstract and purely speculative knowledge of which Bossuet also says elsewhere, "Woe to that barren knowledge which never turns to love, and is false to itself." These words, moreover, limit the object of philosophy. That object is God and man. It is man seeking through the intellect and the will to find goodness and truth, which are God. On the other hand, this definition does not divide those things which are incapable of division, and does not exclude from philosophy a knowledge of bodies and of the visible world. For, says Bossuet, to know man we must know that he is made up of two parts, which are the body and the soul. Hence we see that philosophy also treats of visible and material nature, especially in its relation to the soul and to God. So that the various divisions of philosophy are 1. The knowledge of God, theodicy. 2. The knowledge of the soul, considered in its relations to God and the body, psychology. 3. Logic, which is a further development of psychology and which studies the soul through the intelligence and the laws of that intelligence. 4. Morals, which is another outgrowth of psychology and which studies the soul through its will and the laws of that will. We shall explain these different divisions of philosophy, each in turn, beginning with the theodicy. This order is that of Descartes, Fénelon, Malebranche, and St. Thomas Aquinas. Bossuet followed the inverse order, but we prefer to begin with the theodicy because, in our view, it implies the whole of philosophy. It shows it to us as a unity, a totality. It contains all its roots. Everything proceeds from it. It is therefore the starting point. Moreover, the theodicy, which is the loftiest, most profound department of philosophy, is also the simplest. Ideas of infinity and perfection, as Descartes, Bossuet, and the majority of philosophers remark, are the first which awakening reason reveals to us, which proves that reason first impels us towards God. It is the cause of nature. At the same time that it is the absolute order of truths taken in themselves. But by theodicy must not be understood only the knowledge of God. It also means most particularly the knowledge of the human mind aspiring towards God. The theodicy is the knowledge of that wonderful process of the reason which soars towards God and aspires to know and prove his existence, nature, and attributes. From this point of view, we shall realize later how the theodicy sums up all philosophy in a single question, namely, the proof of the existence of God and his attributes, a question which the readers of this book will, I hope, find neither barren nor commonplace, and upon which we must at once enter. 1. Is it possible to prove the existence of God? Is it essential? Is not the truth of the existence of God self-evident and indemonstrable as an axiom? Can there be atheists? It seems at first that this proposition, God is identical with the similar proposition, being is. And so it really is to all who know the meaning of the word God, since that word means him who is. This statement, therefore, is one of those which are evident as soon as their terms are known. Its terms imply its truth, for the subject and attribute are identical, and it bears its certainty on its face, as does this: the whole is greater than a part. But all men do not know the meaning of the word God, all not understanding that God is none other than he who is. The truth of God's existence is not clear to all, and it requires to be proved from a basis of universal ideas. The proposition which asserts it is identical, but its identity is not apparent to all eyes. And in fact, there are atheists. Atheism, both theoretical and practical, is a profound vice, or rather the radical vice of the heart and human mind. No age has been free from it. Our own is more fully infected by it than we think. Practical atheism is visible to every eye, and philosophical atheism is revealed under the form of pantheism. More yet, Express, exact, avowed, and declared atheism has a school of its own. And this school of new atheism, more scientific than the old atheism, is built upon a foundation which it calls modern science. It is not difficult, in truth, to do justice to this would-be modern science. We shall prove, in the proper place, that it is nothing else than the radical view of the human heart and mind disguised as doctrine, and that its scientific semblance comes from the fact that it applies, though in inverse order, the true method and fundamental process of reason. But first let us assert that the existence of God can be strictly proved, and that no geometrical theorem is more certain. This is, moreover, the opinion of Descartes, as well as of Leibniz. The learned Cardinal Gerdel said the same. We shall treat this point, which implies all metaphysics, all morals, all logic, and all the theory of the method, with the fullness which is deserved by this prime question of philosophy, whose basis and summary it is. 2. In the first place, if there are true proofs of the existence of God, these proofs must be within the reach of all men, for the light of God shines, and should shine upon every man in this world. Therefore, to find useful proofs of the existence of God, we should seek his origin and reality in some ordinary and daily act of the human mind. And this sublime and simple act being found, it will suffice to describe it, and translate it into philosophical language. We shall then prove its scientific value. Now, this ordinary daily act of the human soul, mind and heart, intellect and will, is no other than the universal fact of prayer. And I mean, philosophically speaking, by prayer what Descartes defines when he says, I feel that I am a finite being, unceasingly striving for and aspiring to something better and greater than I am. Prayer is the movement of the soul from the finite towards the infinite. Scorn of present reality, so natural to man, expectation of an ideal future, so habitual to the soul, instinctive sense of the marvelous, and presentiment of infinity, are the source of this sublime and simple act, which proves God. Who does not know it? The soul of man, especially when it is pure and lofty, in its vigor and youth, conceives and desires without bounds all the beauties and virtues of which it sees any trace. All boundaries, all limits, all imperfections are destroyed. Being is conceived in all its plenitude. The mind conceives of eternal love, happiness without change, truth without shadow, a will stronger than any obstacle, strength and energy that play with time and space, and of wonders, sudden creations realized by a word, a gesture, or a wish. All these premonitions of the heart of man, all these golden dreams of childhood, all these intoxications of ideal nectar imply a true and strictly scientific method. Analyzed by reason, this poetry, this faith, contain the strict proof of the existence of God and his attributes. In fact, this is the poetic and ordinary process which, with the help of education and tradition, lifts the majority of men to the knowledge of God. The spectacle of the world, the sense of life, the sight of finished beings and created beauties, when the heart and imagination grasp them, to enlarge and urge them to infinity, by effacing evil, bounds, and limits, that impulse of the soul towards infinity from the finite, this it is that gives men an idea of God, a natural knowledge and love of him. And this intellectual and moral impulse, of which every human soul is capable, is the act and the fundamental process of the life of reason and the moral life. We say that the act and fundamental process of a life of reason and a moral life consist, as Bossuet expresses it, in passing without any circuit of reasoning, although by a very justifiable impulse of the reason from the finite to the infinite, from the genuine finite being, which we are, which we see, which we can actually touch, to the infinite being, really and actually existing, which the existence of the finite implies and supposes. And while the simple, the ignorant, the humble, and the young, by a wholly instinctive and poetic method, perform this chief and necessary act of reason, this natural act of the soul is the foundation of the most scientific of methods, and all the demonstrations of the existence of God given us by true philosophers of all times, summed up and exactly defined by the 17th century, are but the philosophical translation of the ordinary process which all men employ. This we shall show by enumerating and analyzing these various demonstrations, the entire substance of which we will afterwards sum up, and will prove their unerring exactness. 3. But before entering into details and studying these proofs one by one, referring each to its author, we will set forth without going into particulars the nature and conditions of the complete essential proof, to which all others lead back more or less directly, according as they are more or less explicit, solid, and luminous. What we now simply state will be developed and demonstrated later on. We must know that there are two processes of reasoning, the one as exact as the other, syllogism and induction. Syllogism is tolerably familiar, but induction is not the vague process which it is supposed to be. It is a precise process. It is the chief process of reasoning, and has been practiced in all ages by all great minds, as well as by the humblest, but it has never yet been sufficiently analyzed by anyone. We will attempt this analysis by means of logic. These two processes may also be called the syllogistic process and the dialectic process. They correspond to what Leibniz called the logic of deduction and the logic of invention, or the analytical part and the inventive part of logic. They correspond to the two kinds of minds which we find among men and which we may represent by Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle called them syllogism and induction. Plato calls them syllogism and dialectic. The 17th century deserves the credit for establishing the truly mathematical precision of the second process by bringing it into practical use, as Leibniz says, which was done by the works of Descartes, Malebranche, and Fénelon, and by the great discovery of Leibniz, the invention of the infinitesimal calculus, a wonderful invention which consists of actually introducing into mathematics the chief process of reasoning. This process, which in geometry is carried to mathematical infinity, is also carried in metaphysics to the infinite being, which is God. Exact as geometry, it is also much the simpler and quicker of the two processes of reasoning. Its very simplicity and rapidity have hitherto prevented any complete analysis of it. It consists, any degree of entity, beauty, or perfection being given, which we always have so soon as we are, see, or think, it consists, we say, in instantly destroying in thought the limits of the finite being and the imperfect qualities which we possess or which we see, in order that we may affirm, without other intermediary, the infinite existence of the one being and his perfections, corresponding to those we see. Assuredly, the process is a simple one. Anyone may use it, and the smallest minds on certain points employ it as quickly as others, but it is precise. This is now proved by the works of the 17th century, analyzed and compared. This process is not only applicable to the proof of the existence of God, but it leads up in everything to principles and ideas, and as several philosophers who will be quoted in due time declare, it is a universal process of invention. Absolutely distinct from syllogism, it is quite as exact. It alone gives the majors used by syllogism. This process, like syllogism, may rest either upon an abstraction or a fact, an idea or a reality, upon a conception which is a priori true or false, or upon an experience. If the syllogism depends upon a simple possibility which does not exist, upon a chimera, or even on a contradiction which cannot be true, its deductions will be of the nature of the primary cause, a series of non-existent possibilities, or even a series of chimeras or a series of contradictions is deduced, sooner or later ending in downright absurdity, that is to say, in a conspicuous contradiction. But if it rests upon a real postulate derived from the nature of things, as for instance Newton's law, all the deductions drawn from it will be true, genuine, and existent in the nature of things. Now, it is precisely the same with the other process, whether we take for our starting point a pure possibility which does not exist, or a contradictory statement, or even, as Descartes says, a conception proceeding from nothing, which does not and cannot exist. The assertion obtained by the dialectic process will be a simple possibility, a chimera, or a contradiction. But if it be based upon an experimental postulate, a reality, or some actual and positive quality existing in things, then its results will be as real as the point of departure, as real as those of the syllogism. If, for instance, it depended, as in certain German theories, upon the idea of non-being, it would affirm, as the Germans do, an absolute non-being, and all the resultant absurdities. It would thus plainly obtain only a chimera and a monster. But if it rests upon some conception of being, a conception which is clearly possible, it asserts the possibility of an infinite being. If, moreover, it add to this the experience of any real being whatsoever, actually existing, it concludes in the infinite being, no longer as merely possible, but as really and actually existing. And these assertions, which proceed from finite reality to infinite reality, are always true, since in metaphysics, as in geometry, every positive finite has its corresponding infinite. We can always go on asserting to infinity the existence of any real and positive quality, finite though it be, which we see. The assertion is always true in God. This is because its metaphysics, as in geometry, as Leibniz observes, finite laws always hold good of infinity, and vice versa. But if the process de facto be true, de facto again, all do not always carry it out. Just as every mind does not always infer the consequences of principles with which it is familiar, so too every mind does not always move from every finite to the corresponding infinite, or from every phenomenon to ideas, or from every creature to God. Just as there are minds without any syllogistic impulse, so too there are minds destitute of dialectic force. There are intellects which possess neither the one nor the other, neither deduction nor invention. All are necessarily deductive when they are driven to it. There is a logical constraint which can force any man to see a consequence in a principle. But all, as a matter of course, are not necessarily inventive. All do not possess the dialectic impulse. There is no intellectual constraint possible upon this point. The intellect may lose or recover its strength of impulse towards the infinite. That depends upon the energy, the elasticity of the soul, and moral freedom, this impulse being alike and indissolubly intellectual and moral, and it cannot be other than a movement of the human soul as a unity. The intellectual movement towards infinity is always true, always possible, since man is endowed with reason. But as a fact, it cannot take place in the soul without the corresponding moral movement. This is why diseased souls can never perform it, even when the words of others assert it and execute it in their presence. A deduction presented from without is not always understood by a mind but slightly developed. But a moment of careful attention will make it clear. The dialectic passage from the finite to the infinite is still oftener overlooked by weak or diseased minds. A moment of more active attention is not enough. A cure and moral change are requisite. This fact, but too little noted, is most important. It touches on the bond and relation between logic and morals, intellect and will, reason and liberty. There is a bond between reason and liberty. This is unquestionable. There are opinions which are entirely free. Some schools of philosophy admit that all opinions are free and unbiased. This is evidently a mistake, for how can deduction be free? A syllogistic conclusion is inevitable when the primary causes are given, but still it is false to say that every true opinion is inevitable. Dialectic advance from the finite to the infinite, and the opinion which results is both true and free. Yet although always true, is never obtained, save under conditions which depend upon freedom. The first moral condition of the existence of these dialectic decisions which proceed from every finite to the infinite is what may be called the sense of infinity, that divine sense which is always given, which is the omnipresent charm of the sovereign good for every soul. Then, according to the free reciprocal adaptation of each soul to this attraction of infinity, it pronounces or does not pronounce the true opinion which leads from every finite to infinity. It may even, as the whole history of philosophy, especially modern German philosophy, proves, pronounce that false opinion which leads from every finite in an opposite direction from infinity to nothing. The proof of the existence of God, therefore, results from one of the two processes essential to reason, but, as a fact, is worked out freely, morally, as well as rationally. This, I admit, is quite contrary to our wretched logical habits, which presuppose an absolute separation of logic and morals. But this gratuitous supposition might even be called strange, since it admits that intellect and will, two faculties of a single soul, have no common root where they touch. This supposition, I say, is as false as it is strange. It has been, it still is, one of the stumbling blocks of philosophy. It is unquestionable that, as a certain intellectual condition, and not only a condition, but an act, a voluntary act, attention is requisite to execute one of the movements of reason, to form or to comprehend a syllogism. So too we also require a certain moral state, which we may call a right sense, and a voluntary and moral act to understand and execute the other movement of reason. A right sense, which is moreover the same thing as the divine sense, is that hidden reason to which Pascal refers when he says, "The heart has its reasons which the reason does not know." It is this hidden reason which the fool lacks when he says in his heart, "There is no God." Such then is the nature. Such are the conditions of the true proof of the existence of God. In brief, the true proof of the existence of God is nothing else but the use of one of the two processes of reasoning. The chief one, that which gives the majors and which constitutes the logic of invention. Every application of this process involves the proof of the existence of God. Let us repeat. This process consists, starting from every finite being and every finite quality, in affirming, by the suppression of finite limits, the infinite being, or the infinite perfections corresponding to the finite that we see. And this assertion is always true, according to the principle laid down by Leibniz that finite laws hold good of infinity and vice versa. In other words, that the finite is an image of the infinite, which results, as Leibniz also remarks, from the fact that everything is governed by God, who governs all in conformity to himself. This process is as sure as geometry, to which, moreover, it is applied. This application is known as the infinitesimal calculus. On the other hand, this process is never de facto literally carried out, and only reaches God by a simultaneous act of intellect and will, reason and liberty. Its power in the mind is the divine sense, the sense of infinity, or, if you will, the inevitable attraction of the sovereign good for every soul. But this power, given to all, acts or ceases to act, or even changes its course according to the moral state of the soul. We believe that we have proved all this in the totality of the present work, in such a manner that it will henceforth be regarded as among the truths acquired by philosophy. We may be opposed at first, but as all opposition will be vain, we hope our adversaries will soon have recourse to declaring that these things have been known in every age, particularly in the 17th century, and that there is nothing new in what we say. We shall hasten to agree to this, merely reserving to ourselves the honor of having thrown more vivid light upon this central point of philosophy, where all rays meet. This settled, let us turn to details, and proceed to the historic study of the proofs of the existence of God. We shall enter most minutely into this question, studying in turn the theodicy of Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Anselm, and St. Thomas Aquinas. Then take up the theodicy of the 17th century, treating of Descartes, Pascal, Malebranche, Fénelon, Bossuet, Leibniz, and the authors of two Latin theodicies, unknown even to the trained public, which are the two finest and most complete ever written in any age. We shall linger the more willingly upon this point because it will at the same time afford us a study of the history of philosophy. The history of the above-named philosophers is very nearly the whole history of philosophy. Now, we know a philosopher by his theodicy. The theodicy of a writer contains his method, implies his logic and his ethics, is his system of metaphysics, and his theory of ideas also, therefore his psychology. In this sense, all philosophy may be found in the theodicy. In treating, therefore, of the theodicy of all the great minds, each in its turn, we give at the same time a summary and a brief history of philosophy.